F-16s will soon begin arriving in Ukraine, and despite how capable these jets are, they are not stealth aircraft, which means in the heavily contested airspace over Ukraine, some losses are all but inevitable. But while the F-16 may not be as survivable as, say, an F-35, it is still among the best-suited jets in the world for the fight it's heading into. And to better understand why, we need look no further than the Package Q strike from the early days of Operation Desert Storm, when a single F-16 piloted by Major Emmet Tullia managed to dodge not one, or two, or even three, but 6 surface-to-air missiles launched at him in rapid succession. And it wasn't until Major Tullia finished outrunning all these missiles that he found out that his flares and chaff were malfunctioning. In other words, he straight up outflew a half-dozen SAMs with nothing but the aircraft he rode in on and the skill set he had cultivated in training. These days, we look back on the Package Q airstrike from the third day of Desert Storm as the largest F-16 airstrike in history, with some 72 American F-16s from 4 different installations around the region meeting up for wave after wave of strikes against the Tawitha Nuclear Research Center on the outskirts of Baghdad. Now, those 72 F-16s were each armed with 2 2,000-pound Mark 84 bombs, so they were joined by a pack of 8 F-15 Eagles for air coverage and a pack of 8 F-4G Wild Weasels to engage enemy air defenses, and the whole group was escorted by a pair of EF-111 Raven electronic warfare aircraft to jam enemy radar. But as the mission played out, some confusion from the planning stage as well as some bad weather really limited the Wild Weasels and the Ravens' ability to suppress enemy air defenses, and with no enemy fighters scrambled to intercept, the F-15s rapidly became nothing more than targets. So before long, many of these F-16s were operating largely on their own. You see, because of the coalition's dominant victory in Desert Storm, we tend to forget that at the time, Iraq boasted the 6th largest military in the world, and had a sprawling integrated air defense system comprised of some 500 radar arrays positioned in 100 different facilities around the country, all integrated via the French-sourced CARI fire control system, which collectively could bring some 16,000 surface-to-air missile systems to bear. And that was on top of literally thousands of anti-air artillery systems, meaning that if you flew low, you'd be contending with counter-air artillery fire so dense and thick that pilots described it as looking like a cloud of fog below them. And if you flew higher above that counter-air artillery fire, well then all you've got to contend with are telephone pole-sized surface-to-air missile systems closing with you at speeds of around Mach 3 to Mach 3.5 from just below you. It was a veritable hornet's nest that only got thicker the closer you flew to Baghdad. And as the first wave of F-16s reached the outskirts of Baghdad, they found this out firsthand, with some 27 surface-to-air missiles taking to the sky within just 3 minutes of the first F-16 coming into range. And by the time Major Emmet Tullia and his F-16, flying under the callsign Stroke 3, had arrived, one of those F-16s had already gone down, and in fact, almost immediately upon getting to the target area, Tullia's radar warning receiver lit up, letting him know that he was being targeted by a radar-guided surface-to-air missile. Now, this is something American fighter pilots train for relentlessly, and in textbook fashion, Tullia called over the radio, Stroke 3 defending, and broke right, hitting the button to dispense flares and chaff. And when the missile flew by, just barely missing him, Tullia noted that it didn't seem like the flares or chaff affected the trajectory of the missile at all. Now, flares and chaff are both commonly used missile countermeasure systems. Flares are just what they sound like, high-temperature flares that can distract an inbound infrared-guided or heat-seeking missile, whereas chaff produce big clouds of metal shavings that create a large radar return, also meant to confuse inbound radar-guided missiles. And these days, these countermeasures are often deployed automatically when your aircraft detects a threat, but Back in 1991, Tullia needed to do it manually by hitting a button. Now by then, the Eagles were already bugging out, and the Wild Weasels and Ravens had already proven largely ineffectual at managing the sheer mass of air defense assets in the region. So many F-16 pilots decided to bug out as well. But Tullia and several others decided to push on, further into Baghdad to engage their targets. And within just a few minutes, Tullia had dropped both of his 2,000-pound bombs on the oil refinery he'd been assigned. His job was done, and it was time to get out of there. So he turned his aircraft south to head out of the city and back towards Qatar, only to have his radar warning receiver light up again. But this time, he didn't have one missile on his tail, he had three. Three SA-3 missiles, also known as S-125s, the same surface-to-air missiles that 8 years later would shoot down an F-117 Nighthawk over Serbia. Tullia called out over the radio, hit the flare and chaff button, and took evasive action, managing to make all three of these Mach 3.5 missiles miss. But Tullia wouldn't get a chance to celebrate because his evasive action took him straight into the crosshairs of an even more capable and modern SA-6. And as the missile launched, you can hear Tullia on the radio recording, struggling under the G-forces of his maneuvers to call out again. And as that 19-foot-long SA-6 screamed past his aircraft at supersonic speed, Tullia remembered it being close enough to the cockpit for him to hear its engine burning. Tullia had managed to dodge seemingly certain death for the 5th time, but all those evasive actions had scrubbed so much airspeed that he knew he wasn't flying fast enough to dodge the next one. So Tullia made a decision. He decided to put his aircraft into a dive, straight into the fog of exploding anti-aircraft artillery fire just beneath him. And as he did, his radar warning receiver lit up one more time, telling him that he had a 6th surface-to-air missile on his tail. Tullia continued the dive, calling out over the radio and developing enough airspeed to conduct yet another evasive maneuver as he made it out of the battle space. And it wasn't until he made it all the way home, back on his friendly airstrip, that his maintainers let him know that his chaff and flares had malfunctioned, and he had managed to outfly all 6 of those missiles entirely on his own. Now, the F-16s Ukraine is receiving have not been as updated or as upgraded as those employed by the US Air Force, but these F-16s did receive the MLU, or Midlife Update, in the 2000s, which should more or less bring them about on par, technologically speaking, with those employed by the US Air Force back in Desert Storm. However, Russian air defenses have matured since then, and it's important to remember that Major Emmet Tullia was an extremely experienced and highly trained F-16 pilot, and the Ukrainian fighter pilots that will soon be flying these aircraft certainly won't have the same amount of experience in this specific platform. However, they certainly do have the heart and the courage to push this airframe to its limits, and Major Tullia's performance in the Package Q strike back in Desert Storm shows us what the F-16 is really capable of. Now, it is essential for us to remember that this is a big conflict, far too big for any individual system, platform, or weapon to affect the overall outcome all on its own. But the F-16 will provide the Ukrainian Air Force with a number of new capabilities and mission sets they have not had thus far in the conflict, and all in a package that's nimble enough to outfly surface-to-air missiles without even using any countermeasures. But whether or not the F-16 and all the rest of the aid flowing into Ukraine from the West will ultimately be enough to overcome the massive numerical advantage Russian forces still enjoy is anybody's guess. But I'll tell you one thing, and I bet Major Emmet Tullia would even tell you the same. When your life, the mission, or maybe even the future of your nation are on the line, there are not many positions a warfighter could be in to have a greater impact on the outcome of that fight than in the cockpit of a heavily armed F-16. And I, for one, am looking forward to seeing what Ukraine can do with them.